Wait, there we go. I've turned my microphone on. Now you can hear me. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to be delivering a workshop called Debating America in the Age of Trump. It's going to cover a lot of different themes. I'm going to kind of run through the structure now, and then I'm going to talk about, talk through the workshop. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to leave them in the live chat, which I'll be keeping an eye on. Just as a heads up, this workshop is sort of designed if you are not extremely familiar with U.S. politics. I think it's designed for people who have the sort of normal understanding of American politics and what's going on. They know who the president is, they know where America is, and they've consumed a lot of Americanized media, so they have a sort of overall context-based impression of what American politics is like. But I'm going to talk through, I think, what gives a bigger grounding in American politics. If you're a constitutional scholar or you know a lot about American politics, this might not be the most helpful for you, but the second half I think will be very useful because I'm going to talk specifically about how understandings of America and understandings of the United States can apply to debating and talk through some motions and some themes that I think come up in motions. The sort of structure of this workshop is in a few parts. The first sort of bit is going to be a Civics 101 lecture or a Civics 101 lesson for about sort of 10 or 15 minutes. It's going to talk through the structure of American government and because of that structure, what incentives are at play, what sort of things are different from other political systems because the American system is very particular and very, very different from a lot of other democratic systems around the world. I'm going to talk through some themes and trends in American politics and society that I think are particularly relevant for debating and that most people will be familiar with, and talk through sort of how to be knowledgeable of them about those trends and how to apply them in debating. I've got another section that's sort of headlined Trump and Trumpism. It's going to talk through sort of the phenomenon of Trumpism and Trump as a particular actor, and what that means. Then I'm going to talk through the sort of last three parts are called Staying Informed, which is about how to be informed in a way that's useful for debating without necessarily becoming overwhelmed or focusing too much on the detail. I've got a reading list that suggests some articles that I think give a sort of good snapshot right now of American politics and gives you a grounding in some issues that are very important. And then I'm going to talk through some motions and some of the themes that I think come up mostly about the United States in motions. Okay, so the current political situation in America is very fast moving. So probably the most fast moving we've seen in the last several decades. This isn't really intended to capture the most recent political events or to sort of bring you up to date on the Mueller investigations or anything like that. It seeks to give you a base level of understanding of actor incentives, political structures, and current themes and trends. So which can equip you even as political facts change. So diving into the first part of American political structure. So the United States, so if we cast our minds back many years to the founding of America, we can think about the reasons why the American founders designed the American government the way they did. So these are Enlightenment philosophers who are determined to start their own country in reaction to what they see as the overwhelming control of a dictator. So they're seeking to separate the United States of America from British control. They think that the British king has overstretched himself and is imposing illegitimate authority on American citizens. But as Enlightenment, as men of the Enlightenment, specifically often as slaveholders, they're extremely worried about civil resistance. They've seen the beginnings of the American Revolution, which were characterized by looting and riots. And as Enlightenment philosophers, they're also extremely aware of the ways in which overwhelming civil resistance or overwhelming direct action can destabilize countries. So they designed the government in a way that to many may seem contradictory, but to Americans, but to the men who were determined to found America, it makes sense. The American founding documents are called the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence is probably the one that you're most familiar with. It's the one that begins, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So most people will be vaguely familiar with that text. It also includes the Bill of Rights, which lays out a number of rights that are inalienable to American citizens. I've included those or transcripts of those texts in my reading list, mostly because those texts are, aside from your interest in debating, those texts are some of the most seminal political texts in world history. They are one of the first instances in which a group of individuals lay out their philosophy of government and design a government. This led to some problems, of course, which you probably are aware of. That a number of compromises had to be made in the creation of the American government in order to satisfy all of the different actors who were interested in founding the U.S. To that end, the United States government is divided into three branches. These are the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. I'm going to talk through each of them in turn and talk about their powers and some of the particular elements to the American system that I think affects the actor incentives in the context of American politics. There's a lot of different diagrams of the three wings of American government all around the internet, so you can definitely have a quick Google of those. The executive branch is going to be the branch most people are most familiar with. The executive branch is the branch of the government. The sort of title of the executive branch is that it enforces the law, but obviously the executive branch has quite wide-reaching powers to affect the law on a number of different fronts. I'll talk through some of those. The legislative branch is supposed to be the branch that creates laws. Now, if any of you have been paying attention to American politics in the last, I don't know, last at least 8 years, you'll know that the Congress legislates infrequently. It's probably a diplomatic way of describing it. However, there's a reason why Congress is so intransient and often difficult to control. And I'll talk through that when we talk about through the legislative branch. The last branch is also one you're probably familiar with, the judicial branch. The most famous part of the judicial branch is the Supreme Court, but it's important to recognize that the Supreme Court isn't the only part of the judicial branch, and all across American courts are individuals involved in the act of interpreting and applying the law to the judicial system. Okay, so I don't think there's any questions as of yet, so I'm gonna move on to talking about the powers of the executive branch. So the president is one of the more particularly American institutions. The role of the president, or the position of the president, replaces the head of state that most states embody in someone with significantly less power than Americans do. In the UK, the head of state is embodied in a hereditary monarch with very little political power, except the ability to attract millions of tourists every year. Or an example of a non-hereditary or non-monarchical system would be in Ireland, where Ireland embodies their head of state in a president that has a largely ceremonial role, very different from the role of the president. However, the American president has very significant powers and exercises them to great effect. And in most political writing or most political thought, you believe the role of the president and the responsibilities of the president and what the president can do has expanded significantly since the founding of America. This is because of a number of different reasons. This is because sometimes the design of the American government has not been as well designed, perhaps, as the founders would have hoped for. And it's been important for an individual actor to be able to take immediate action or to act when Congress or the judicial branch aren't able. Some of the president's but it's really important to remember, I think, for American politics and for debating America in general, even when presidents can't act or presidents' powers are curtailed, they are held responsible by the electorate for the success or failure of the country during their term. I think it's Ronald Reagan has the very famous phrase, "the buck stops here," which is that the American president is held responsible for the American country, regardless of whether or not the American president, whether they've all been men so far, has been able to affect any change. This is illustrated in the way that the American president is often held responsible for the economy of the United States government, despite the fact that the president doesn't have a significant amount of control over economic policy, doesn't have as much control over an economic policy as Congress does. And often because the president is acting after whatever economic crisis or economic problem, and so isn't able to have as much an effect as I think most Americans believe. However, it doesn't particularly matter how much what the president can do, because most people believe that the president is in the end responsible. Some of the president's most important powers include nominating Supreme Court judges and naming his cabinet. We'll get to the Supreme Court in a minute, but the cabinet are involved in the day-to-day running of government with oversight led by the congressional committees. So these include the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, the Department of what's called HUD, which is Housing and Urban Development. There are a number of different departments for which cabinet officials are appointed. The most important are probably the State Department, which enforces American foreign policy abroad. So cabinet officials and the departments of government have a lot of power to change the experience of those who use government services. And those who use government services in America can be everyone from veterans to welfare recipients, students, nurses, anyone who's involved in anything that the government has a significant regulatory power over, or areas in which the government delivers services itself. For instance, national parks, and in a number of other examples. For instance, there are hospitals owned by the government that are run specifically for veterans. So that would be controlled by the Department for Veteran Affairs. They have a lot of power to change the experience of these individuals. I think we can most see this through the actions recently of the Department of Health and Human Services in the last month to gut open enrollment for Obamacare, where when change hasn't been possible legislatively, the president and the executive branch have the power to significantly reduce the number of people with access to health care despite no changes in the law, because they control how the country is governed. They control how Obamacare is governed, how long open enrollment, which is the period of time which people can sign up for health care through the Obamacare programs. They control many of those elements. They have a significant role to play in how people interact with the government. There's I've also included a link in a Google Doc that I'm going to post in the description of this YouTube video which is a very thorough review of the powers given to the president by the Constitution and the conventions observed around them. Okay, now because we're doing kind of a speed version of Civics 101, we're now going to talk about the Congress. We're now going to talk about Congress. So the United States legislative branch is referred to as Congress. Now, there are two parts to Congress. This sometimes confuses people because we talk about Congress and the House and Senate often interchangeably. It's important to remember the full body is called Congress. One body is the House and one body is the Senate. Both of these bodies sit within Congress. So when we refer to Congress, we mean both of those together. When we refer to the House, we mean just the House of Representatives. And when we refer to the Senate, we mean just the Senate. So the House and the Senate are the two federal legislative bodies of the United States. In the House, elections are held on even years, so years that end in even numbers, with representatives serving for 2 years. House representatives have very short terms by most democratic standards. 2 years is not a very long time. And House representatives are appointed by population. The minimum number of representatives a state can have is 1. So there's a few states that have just 1 representative. So Montana, which is a very low population, has just 1 representative, while more populous states like California or Texas have significantly more representatives. California currently has the most representatives in the House. It has 53 House representatives. Now, if we compare that with the Senate, senators serve terms of 6 years, which is much longer than 2 years. And the terms are staggered so that approximately 1/3 of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. Each state has 2 senators. Even states with very small populations, such as Montana, only have 2 senators. Even states with very large populations, such as California, only have 2 senators. This was part of a very famous compromise in the founding of America, where states with large populations wanted a single legislative body in which individuals were appointed, in which representatives were appointed by a population. States with very low populations or much smaller states wanted a single legislative body in which representatives were appointed by a state more equally, so similar to the Senate. A compromise was made in which there are 2 houses in the Congress, one of which is proportionally represented by population, not by votes, but there are more representatives for states with more population, and this means that, and then there's a Senate. Then there's a Senate House, which has the compromise of they are appointed by a state, so there are 2 for every state. This means that both houses of Congress have elections every 2 years, which is a very short election cycle for most democracies. So most democracies are not holding major legislative elections every 2 years. The United States is quite different. It has these elections that are for very important offices of power that control the legislation of government every 2 years. This 2-year cycle means that elections are held both in years of presidential elections, because presidents serve for 4 years, and midway through a president's term. So this means, if we're holding President Trump, for example, this means that there were elections for senators and House representatives held during the same election of Donald Trump. Now, we're about a year from Donald Trump's election. In another year, we're going to have another election just for House representatives and senators. That's called, and those are referred to as the midterms. At least in the modern era, it's very important to remember that midterms are often considered a reflection of a president's success or failure. Obama was elected with a majority Democratic House and Senate, and then in his first midterm, the midterm 2 years into his first term, this was flipped, and Republicans came into the majority. This is one of the reasons why, compared to most parliamentary systems, it is possible for the president to be from one party and the majority of the legislative house to be from another party. It's very important to remember, because parliamentary systems don't have this. For instance, the United Kingdom, if the prime minister was from a party that was not in the majority, the government would collapse, or there would be some sort of coalition deal, and even a coalition deal would eventually secure that they were in the majority and able to get legislation passed. Now, this is one of the contributing reasons as to why Congress and to why legislation in the United States is almost famous for gridlock and famous for little legislation. This is partially on purpose. There was a number of American founders who were concerned about government power. Remember that they had just broken away from a government that they thought was too powerful and was asserting too much power. And so they were concerned that a government would try and control too much of its citizens' lives. This is some of the Thomas Jefferson, yeoman farmer kind of deal, where they had a very different image of what America was going to become after the founding. So it's important to remember, I think, this is not to the founders, at least, this is not necessarily a bug in the system, but sort of more of a feature. Obviously, for people who need the government to legislate, most Americans, this is definitely a bug in the system. But it kind of explains, I think, where some of the gridlock comes from American politics. Because if you are in the majority in the House or the Senate, and the president is from a different party, you don't want them to look good. So you don't want to pass their legislative agenda. You don't want their policies to be enacted well. You want to oppose them. And if you're in the majority, you have the power to do that. It's really, currently, the House and the Senate both have majority Republican leadership. So this means the Speaker of the House in the House of Representatives, which is usually seen as the more junior House, is Paul Ryan. And the majority leader of the Senate is Mitch McConnell. These are both Republicans. If you are not very familiar with American politics, or you've just started with your reading, you're going to read about these guys a lot. You also are going to read about the minority leaders. So just like other parliamentary systems, there are minority parties, and they attempt to leadership or demonstrate that they're better able to govern or get legislation passed. Minority leader of the House, so Paul Ryan's better half, is Nancy Pelosi, Democrat. And the minority Senate leader is Chuck Schumer, a Democrat. We're going to mention Nancy and Chuck in a little bit as part of our discussion of Trumpism. Final branch of American government in our sort of 400 miles an hour rush through American civics. The final branch of American government is the judiciary. Technically, this includes a whole host of circuit courts on multiple levels across the country. Mostly, the judicial branch of the United States government that you'll be interacting with in debates is the Supreme Court. There might be some discussion of circuit level courts, and I think it's useful context to understand, if you're going to be talking about the judicial system, to know that there are other levels of courts where decisions are made, and an appeals process by which cases move up those courts. But you're not going to need to know a lot of the details about them. Most courts in the United States, most circuit courts around the U.S. are appointed for life terms. Most judges are serving life terms are going to be judges until they die. Usually they're appointed by their state governor. They might be appointed by their state legislative house. I'll get to the state division in the U.S. in just a minute. However, there are some parts of the country in the United States where judges are elected. This is a bit messed up. I'm gonna agree. but there are some states where the tradition of electing judges or the process of electing judges holds over. So this does mean that some judges in the United States are subject to electoral interests. They are worried about getting reelected. They are worried about appearing tough on crime. They are worried about campaigns to get them unelected. So it is not the case all the time that all judges in the United States are for life terms. However, we're going to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court now, which is probably the most important one. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States, and Supreme Court judges are appointed from qualified individuals by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. So it's the president that chooses who's going to be on the Supreme Court, and then they have to be confirmed by the Senate. This is made difficult when the Senate is not from the same party as the president. But in the past, it's usually been the case that American presidents would make the decisions of who they would appoint in the hope that they would get passed by the Senate. There are 9 positions on the Supreme Court. So there should always be 9 Supreme Court judges, and they serve for life terms, meaning that presidents can only nominate to fill positions because the judge has retired or died. They don't usually retire, but currently there are 3 living retired Supreme Court judges, including Sandra Day O'Connor, who's the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. So the fact that there are retired Supreme Court judges is not super important, but they are usually called in to serve on sort of lower down circuit courts, or they fill in. They do still act as judges in many circuit courts, so they aren't relevant. But they're not the Supreme Court anymore. So there are 9 Supreme Court justices right now. So John Roberts is the Chief Justice, and he's often considered one of the swing justices. Most justices there, or most of the Supreme Court judges, their positions or their political opinions or their philosophical opinions on the Constitution are pretty well known. This is because they're extremely important people in the country, and also because they're vetted extremely hard on their way. They're vetted to an extreme degree on their way to becoming a Supreme Court judge. And if they are qualified enough to be a Supreme Court judge, we have a lot of their written material. We have a lot of their philosophical opinions on the law to read through. So if you're more interested in the sort of legal aspect of American debating about America, or you have interacted with emotion about the Supreme Court before, I definitely recommend doing a basic Googling and reading a Wikipedia page on a few of the Supreme Court justices, because it gives you a good understanding of how decisions can go in the Supreme Court. Okay, so the Supreme Court justices are John Roberts, the Chief Justice. He's usually considered more of a swing justice, or more of a swing vote. We also have Anthony Kennedy, Clarence Thomas, the second ever African American to serve on the Supreme Court Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's probably one of the more famous justices who served very long term. Stephen Breyer, Sam Alito, Sonia Sotomayor, the first Hispanic Supreme Court justice who was appointed by Obama, Elena Kagan, and Neil Gorsuch. So Neil Gorsuch was appointed recently to fill Antonin Scalia's seat by Donald Trump. So the Supreme Court, what are the Supreme Court's powers? So the Supreme Court can strike down legislation that it rules to be unconstitutional. This can happen to legislation that's passed at any point in the country. So in the United States, there are laws that are federal laws that are passed by the federal legislature, Congress, or there are state laws that are passed by state legislatures. So this means that there are some powers that are reserved to the states and some powers that are reserved to the federal Congress. If you're British, this is somewhat similar to the ways in which powers are devolved to certain parliaments around the country. But it's the same way that many regional governments, it can be similar to the way that many regional governments operate across different parts of Europe or the world. However, states are quite powerful in terms of the powers they have compared to the federal government and compared to other regional governments around the world. Now, this was because in the founding of the United States, it was conceived much more of a sort of federation of states, in which states were able to protect their own interests. This is partially as a compromise with slaveholding states in the South, who were worried about their futures if they were not able to continue to hold slaves in comparison to northern states. This was a problem even at the beginning in the founding of the United States. I'll talk a little bit more about the intersection of slavery with the United States later on in my section on sort of trends and themes in American politics. But the Supreme Court has the power to strike down legislation. So this is what it can do, where it can rule, for instance, that laws forbidding same-sex couples to marry are unconstitutional. This is what it did recently, which is what guaranteed the rights of American citizens to American citizens who wanted to marry the same rights as heterosexual couples. But the Supreme Court is always walking a fine line between its written powers and the capacity it has to strike down unconstitutional legislation and to sort of legislate in the way that it philosophically believes to be correct, and the powers that it can actually wield. Because it's important to remember the judicial branch doesn't have any powers to enforce the law. It relies on the powers of the executive and in some ways the powers of Congress to enforce the decisions it makes. And if it makes a decision that cannot be enforced, which it has in the past, that it doesn't particularly matter whether or not that law is ruled unconstitutional if it's not observed. So it walks a fine line between convention and observation, and making sure that it is able to legislate in a way, it is able to interpret the law in a way that will be enforced. There are kind of two main schools of interpretation in the Supreme Court, and I think are important to understand. Antonin Scalia who's since passed away, was one of the major proponents of the sort of more literal, legalistic understanding of the Constitution, in which he believed we should not interpret the Constitution beyond what the founders wrote to us. We're not able to sort of read their minds. We're not able to know what they were thinking. We should read the Constitution and believe that what they wrote down was what they believed, and therefore we should interpret the Constitution in a narrow way, in which we say, if this meets with a very narrow definition of what the Constitution says, we should follow that. Some other proponents, there are different schools of thought. Ruth Bader Ginsburg falls into the other category, in which the intention of the Constitution is something that we should be more concerned with litigating, and that we can interpret the intentions of what the Constitution meant, or what the founders meant when they wrote the Constitution. A good example of this is the right to privacy that the Constitution guarantees. Now, it's unclear to what extent this extends to, because there are a number of elements of the Constitution that guarantee privacy, but does this privacy extend to our digital lives? Does this privacy extend to, for instance, abortion, which was how Roe v. Wade was interpreted, in that the right to privacy guarantees the right to an abortion? It's unclear, especially since the Constitution is obviously a much older document than America is today, or the current modern America, and so interpretation is something that the Supreme Court is supposed to do, but there's a lot of differing opinions over how the Constitution should be interpreted. It's important to remember that a number of the most controversial decisions of the Supreme Court, or a number of the most controversial culture war elements of American politics in the last 20 or 30 years, has involved the Supreme Court. Legislation around same-sex couples was done by the Supreme Court, and legislation about abortion, the most famous case, Roe v. Wade, which guaranteed citizens of the United States the right to an abortion, was done through the Supreme Court. This is because often activists believe the law is the easiest way to achieve legislative change, because of the difficulties of getting a president elected, the amount of money that it's required to lobby Congress, and the deadlock and the lack of guarantee that any legislation would ever get passed because of Congress. This means that many activists or many groups have found the Supreme Court and the law the best way to proceed. There's differing opinion over how successful that has been, especially if political opinion changes and the executive branch is less willing to enforce the opinions or the interpretations of the Supreme Court, which is something we may see in the coming years, especially around same-sex marriage and the right to and a woman's right to an abortion in the United States. Okay, Civics 101. That's kind of a rush through American structure, but that's Civics 101 kind of covered. Next, we're going to talk about trends and themes in American politics and society, and this is going to kind of feed into the section on Trump and Trumpism. So, trends and themes in American politics and society. There's kind of a number of headlines that I think I've identified here that I think are most relevant to debating. So, first of all, I think it's important to understand the entrenchment of inequality and economic slowdown, or economic drag, is what I think sometimes is what I've called it here, that most Americans experience. The United States is deeply economically unequal, and compared to previous years of economic growth, while the economy may be growing and while unemployment may be low, wages have stagnated and a number of people are in insecure work. Additionally, this plays into significant geographical separations in the United States, where economic growth or economic success is often concentrated in particular geographical parts of the United States and doesn't reach to other parts. The United States is a very diverse country, not just in terms of its people, but also in terms of its economic capacity, in terms of its education, in terms of legislation, in terms of different legislation, meaning that states and different parts of the United States often have very different standards of living, very different economic models, and very different experiences of their citizens. Economic growth has been concentrated, for instance, in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington, which has been around famous startups like Amazon, or in California around Silicon Valley, or around creative enterprises in New York, or around healthcare and oil in the South and Texas, especially in Houston, has not spread to other parts of the country. There are large parts of the country that still experience low economic growth, still experience significant unemployment, and like many countries, that is concentrated in particular communities. This is probably the most famous is in the Appalachians, which is sometimes called the Rust Belt, which is suffering from deindustrialization and a lack of interest in American coal and American industry. However, so this means that American economic separation often mirror American cultural separations. The different parts of the United States that are divided up culturally often think of themselves as very distinct from one another. Despite the fact that America has a very strong sense of nationalist pride, there are very distinct cultural parts of the United States that feel themselves to be very different. This is from the East Coast and New England to the South, to even distinctions within the South, in which Louisianans and Texans would think of themselves as very different. This has played into what I think the media, or what I think legislators have referred to as the growing culture war. So this is the fact that large parts of the American social landscape feel themselves to be in direct competition, or feel themselves to be engaged in some sort of conflict with other parts of the country. This is, I think, characterized by a number of Trump sort of salvos at different parts of the country, the feelings including Black NFL players, including the Black Lives Matter movement, but also including West Coast liberals, like those who are most famously from California, but liberals across the country. This idea that different cultural parts of the United States are in conflict with one another is something I think has been a deep seam tapped into by Trumpism, tapped into by this anti-establishment, anti-elite rhetoric. But I think a more important question, or a bigger question, is, has America always been at culture war? Because if you are at all familiar with American history, or if you even consume Americanized media, I think culture war, or this sort of conflict between the different American cultural elements, is something that's been at play in American society and American politics for a very, very long time. Notice, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but notice this rhetoric of culture war, this rhetoric of conflict, is often highly geographicalized, which means that it's often setting different parts of the country that live separately from one another, and therefore often don't interact very much, setting them against one another. This is often good for politicians, because politicians are trying to get elected in a specific geographical area. They're trying to get elected in a state. They're trying to get elected in a district. And so there's often an incentive for them to try and set parts of the country against each other. But notice this narrative of culture war, this narrative that we are up against someone who wants to take something from us, we're up against someone who wants to change our way of living, is heavily racialized. America is an incredibly racially diverse country, but it's a country in which racial groups have been highly segregated. This is because of systematic redlining across the country that has set housing policy to divide racial groups in the United States, and because of demographic and because of the patterns of immigration and demographics that have divided America America's sort of racial map, meaning that there are huge communities, especially in certain parts of the country that are largely white, that don't interact with many other people, from other racial groups around the country. So this narrative of culture war is heavily racialized. That's something that I think plays into a deep seam in American history. America is a country founded on racially based wars, a country founded on the persecution of the Native Americans, a country founded on the persecution and chattel slavery of African Americans. This is a country that has this in its history and has had it in its history for its entire existence. So the idea that sort of race in America, or the idea that racial politics or identity politics is sort of sprung onto the scene, I think is not a correct one. But a lot of Americans, prior to the advent of mass social media, have been able to, or prior to the advent of like the 24-hour news cycle, have been able to live in relative isolation from this narrative of culture war. That is changing, and that's something that has changed, I think, in the last 20 or 30 years, that has really affected the rise of individuals, of politicians like Trump. Finally, I think another sort of theme that's important to recognize in American politics is what I've called a diminishing America in the world. America is one of the world's superpowers. Up until a few years ago, or up until maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, it probably would have been described as the world's only superpower. But I think there are a number of countries that are competing to become America's next rival, to become America's next other superpower. So America has at least existed for the last several decades in a world in which it was the only superpower since the fall of the USSR. And I think this sort of mental change, this sort of cultural change to a world in which it is not the only superpower, is one that has really affected American politics and how Americans think about themselves. And so I think a lot of countries a lot of people around the world, a lot of societies very fairly get very tired of this narrative of like, they care about how Americans think about themselves and what Americans sort of think about their own society, or like we shouldn't have to care about this because we're not American. I think it's a very fair accusation, but I don't think it works for America, for thinking about the world's politics or thinking about how America affects the world. Because America is one of the most powerful countries on the world. It has the most advanced military. It definitely spends the most on its military. Its military is probably one of the most active in the world. It contributes the vast majority of resources to a number of international institutions. It has the largest economy in the world. It is one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. And so considering how Americans think about themselves and how Americans think about their country is very important for understanding America's role in foreign policy. So considering a diminishing America in the world, Americans who are alive now have lived through the period of America's longest ever war, the Iraq War, which is the current longest period of continuous warfare the United States has been engaged in. They've also lived through a war on terrorism that it is unclear the United States has won. As in there have been many attacks on U.S. soil, like including one in New York in the last few days, since 9/11, which the war on terror was supposed to end. It means that American civil liberties have decreased, which most white Americans probably don't interact with, but a lot of Americans from other racial groups have definitely interacted with a decrease in their civil liberties. But it also means the media has definitely portrayed America as less successful and less active in the world. I also think the presidency of George W. Bush had a part to play in this, which a lot of Americans, especially Americans who care about what other people in the world think about them, I think we're even extremely right-wing ones, I think we're deeply shaken by a period in America's history in which Americans and America was not well liked in the rest of the world. I have been, or at least partially have been, an American living abroad for the last however many decades. And I think the unique shame of living abroad as an American under the presidency of George W. Bush was something that I think a lot of Americans were shaken by. I think this is, but that kind of discussion is still taboo in America. It's still important to talk about America as the greatest superpower, the greatest country in the world. I think a good example of this is if you can go back in the deep stands of time, back when scandals were just about what the president's wife said. Michelle Obama was involved in a big scandal in which she said that when her husband was elected, it was when she finally felt proud of America. Now, this is deeply taboo for an American president to suggest, or for an American politician, for the wife of an American politician to suggest that they might have experienced a period in which they weren't proud of America. Despite the fact that most Americans, like Michelle Obama's political inclinations or political leanings, probably have experienced a long period of their life in which they weren't proud of the United States. So the sort of concept of a diminishing America in the world, An America that is now that in the next few years is probably going to become one of two superpowers as opposed to one of the only superpowers is something that Americans feel very deeply. And I think it's because Americans consume a great deal of, I think, what historians in the future might call propaganda, but which we currently call Hollywood, about the success or the grandiosity of American experience, and that Americans should be considered the sort of prime understanding of human experience in the world. Now, how does this interact with Trump and Trumpism? So Trumpism is a little bit different from Trump the actor. I'm going to consider them both separately. But I think Trumpism recognized the elements of modern America that Trump has tapped into. What parts of the sort of American psyche, what parts of the psyche of the electorate has Trump found that work so well for him, that allow him to defy every rule of political understanding, that allow him to be dogged by scandal again and again, that allow him to be implicated in crimes, that allow him to be implicated in serious allegations of sexual assault, and still become president? What has led to that? I think that's one of the big questions that come up a lot in debates. One of the big sort of debates around this is sort of rehashing the election. What went wrong? What happened? What could have been done differently? Why is Donald Trump, a man with no previous political experience, who is not very good at being president, how did he become president? So I think there are a number of sort of elements that Trump has tapped into that are sort of characteristic of what people might call Trumpism. I think these include the element of the culture war that I've been talking about, the idea that there are parts of America, often very heavily racialized parts of America, that are in conflict with one another, that there is some sort of war going on, some sort of war that people have to win. I think Trump has also tapped into significant racial instability and significant racial fear in the United States. Like polls of Trump voters or polls of those who identify as Trump voters have overwhelmingly shown that the majority of them have demonstrated sort of racial anxiety or racial fear. And there is some part of Trumpism that is directed at a racial understanding of the United States. Now, I'm definitely not the person to talk about that or the person to offer the best insight on that, but in my reading list, I've included a number of articles that I think are the most interesting. And I think if you're particularly interested in the elements of this and the way that Trump represents sort of white supremacist element of American history, Ta-Nehisi Coates is definitely the best writer on this currently, like in any shape or form. You should read The Atlantic, which has the best writing on American culture and society, I think, going on currently. And I think that'll help you give it the best understanding of that. I also think Trump has tapped into these elements of the diminishing America in the world that I tapped in, this anti-globalism, the idea that other countries aren't grateful enough for America's help, the idea that other countries are trying to take away from America's greatness, this anti-globalism that says that American citizens have given up too much for the rest of the world. Now, I think it's debatable whether this is true or not, considering that the ways in which Americans have tried to benefit the rest of the world has overwhelmingly been to the rest of the world's detriment. But the way that Americans feel, or the way that a lot of the American electorate feels about anti-globalism, I think has been tapped into by this Trumpism. I think finally also anti-establishment feeling. The idea that this is sort of new in American politics, I think, is wrong. Anti-establishment feeling has been very important in American history, and there's always been this trend of the idea that American politicians should not be part of the establishment, that we should refresh them, there should always be new politics. This kind of exists in contradiction with the fact that American politicians are overwhelmingly re-elected. The re-election rates for senators and House representatives is really high compared to most other countries. So there's kind of this tension, I think, between the idea that we re-elect a lot of our representatives, and also we don't want them to be from the elite or from the establishment. So there's this tension, I think, that Trumpism kind of tapped into and played with and understood that could really affect how people voted. I also think Trumpism has tapped into the legacy of the Republican Party. I'm going to talk a little bit about American parties here. America, obviously, a two-party system. There's other parties, but they don't really matter. Sometimes there's a third-party candidate that can have a significant effect. So like most of you know Bernie Sanders, but Bernie Sanders isn't really a third-party candidate. He doesn't stand against any of the other candidates in the actual election. Best example is Ralph Nader standing as a third-party candidate. A lot of left-leaning people, a lot of young liberals vote for Ralph Nader instead of voting for John Kerry, and George W. Bush wins the election. Now, this isn't the only reason. I think Ralph Nader was that election. I don't know. But Ralph Nader was a significant third-party candidate that you should definitely do some Googling into if you are interested in how third-party candidates affect American politics. That's not the most relevant. It's not going to come up a lot, I think. But Democrats, Republicans. These are the two main parties. Party is very strong in America because you kind of need to be. They have very significant. They have a lot of money, very significant bases all across the country. But there's only two parties for a huge country with significant geographical and cultural divides. How is this managed? Well, both of them have to be kind of big tent, as in there are a lot of different kinds of people that are involved in the coalitions of both parties. And there are a lot of people that could very plausibly be in either party, which is what happens when you try and have two parties to represent all of the political spectrum. It's just like not really representative. But that means that you can have people in the Republican Party that could very conceivably be Democrats in any other state. Good examples: Susan Collins from Maine, who's a liberal Republican. She's a representative from Maine. She is one of the major votes against Obamacare repeal because she's a liberal senator who wants to keep Obamacare for her representatives. But on the for her constituents, on the other side of that same divide, we have extremely hawkish deficit hawks in the Republican Party, or extremely Tea Party people from the Freedom Caucus in the Republican Party who are also voting against Obamacare repeal, not because they want to keep Obamacare, but because they think it doesn't get rid of it enough. So we have these two very, very different people who are involved in the Republican Party. The same is true of Democrats. Democrats have the same kind of coalition problem where they need to sort of cobble together this coalition of different people from all around the country that have very different interests and that are often diametrically opposed or believe very different things. So how do you cobble together this coalition of organized labor, of ethnic minorities, of sort of urbanized liberals? Like, how do you cobble together that coalition as a party and make it work? Now, Republican Party has one answer to this. The Republican Party has sort of designed itself into an election-winning machine, as in it is significantly better at winning elections than the Democratic Party is. Why? One, the Republican Party has become a lot better than the Democratic Party at mobilizing its base, at making its base believe that absolutely under no circumstances can the other side win, that it would be the worst thing ever. Now, I'm not denying that there are people in the Democratic Party who believe that if Republicans win, terrible things are going to happen to them, because that's true. There are lots of people who are sincere Democrats who know that when Republicans get elected, bad things happen to them because they're a woman, because they're an ethnic minority, for a number of different reasons. However, the way the Republican Party has been able to mobilize its base has been different from that. One, this has a lot to do with the Republican Party's involvement in the media, especially in Fox News, but in lots of other different forms of media, and the way the Republican Party has been able to mobilize conspiracy theories and extremism. Now, this is not exactly the most irritable interpretation of Republican action, but Trump is an heir to the Republican Party, to the way in which the Republican Party peddled conspiracy theories about the Clintons when the Clintons were in government, to a lesser extent. Like, there's a linear relationship here between time and conspiracy theories, and the way the Republican Party, the way the Tea Party fully accepted conspiracy theories about Obama under his presidency. This was made for rational. This decision was not made, I think, purely for ideological whatever. This is a rational decision about how to win elections. If you have a Tea Party that is trying to basically saying that the deficit is the most important thing, we need to cut taxes immediately, and the Tea Party is this very radical element of the Republicans, you can either make a deal with those people and say, you can stay in the Republican Party and we're going to take on your policy proposals and we're going to believe your crazy theories about Obama being from Kenya, and you're still going to vote for us. All the people that really, really believe in what you think are going to come out and are going to come out and stump for us. They're going to come out and vote for us. They're going to come out and campaign for us, and we're going to be able to win elections off the back of this. Democratic Party has made different decisions in which the Democratic Party has said, no, we're not going to concede to your policy proposals to lots of different groups, whether this is the activism of African Americans in the Democratic Party, in which a lot of their policy proposals or their demands for more representation have not been met, whether this has been the activism of organized labor or the activism of American socialists. Democratic Party has not been willing to make those compromises. Debatable on which of those is the correct one, but notice that one of them wins elections. So it isn't the case that I think Republicans are just like that. It is the case that the Republican Party has made real decisions about how to win elections. Now, one of the other downsides of this is potentially that the Republican Party is less able to govern than the Democratic Party. But that distinction becomes academic when the Democratic Party can't get to a position in which to govern, right? You can't govern if you don't win elections. So that kind of answers, I think, how we got to Trumpism. But what about Trump? What about Trump the actor? So there are a number of questions that we're going to ask, and then we're going to try and answer. Notice that these questions aren't going to be answered all the way, but don't feel bad about that, or don't feel bad about your concerns about answering them, considering that there are literal professional journalists whose job it is to write and think about the president all day long, and they don't have these answers. So the first one of these, is Trump a rational actor? Then the next one is, can Trump control his base? Like how, to what extent is the people who voted for Trump listening to Trump or controlling him? And then the last one of how much of this, and by this I mean everything that's happening all the time, like all the scandals and the Trump-Russia investigations and the almost causing nuclear war via Twitter and all these other things. How much of this is Trump, and how much of it is the people around him? Because I think there's a lot of disagreement over that. So first of all, is Trump a rational actor? So this often is a disagreement that happens a lot in debates, because on one side of the debate you'll have people say, well, Trump doesn't make rational decisions, he's clearly making crazy decisions, or create decisions that are based in no fact, or he's like not very good at being a politician, or he's never had any political experience before. He's not a rational actor. We can't attribute rational incentives to him. But so first of all, I think a way to counteract this debate is prove that clearly he does have some incentives that we can interpret. For instance, the way he lashes out at those who opposed him during the electoral process. Well, that's clearly the actions of someone who has rational incentives to get elected, who is trying to oppose those who are not trying to get him elected. So I think Trump, in many ways, has very similar incentives to any politician. His incentives are to stay in power and get stuff done. I think it's debatable about like what that power looks like or what that stuff looks like. But I think the idea that Trump is a completely irrational actor is a theory that has not particularly stood up since the end of the primary period. If you're in a debate where I think in which claims are made about Trump not being a rational actor, I think a really important way to contradict this is to explain how many of Trump's actions might align with rational incentives that could be easily attributable to him. The incentive to stay in power, the incentives to appear as if someone who could stay in power, for instance, firing Bannon after it became politically unpalatable to have him as a national security advisor anymore. Those are all actions that could indicate someone with rational incentives. So I think it's not particularly useful in debates, or useful for your side, or useful for your argument to say that Trump doesn't have rational incentives. Clearly, there are some ways in which he may, and it's important for you, in order to support your side of the debate and for your argument, to argue that he does have rational incentives. 2, can Trump control his base? Now, there's, I think, more disagreement over this one, because there are many ways in which Trump is fundamentally the only source of news, or the only source of fact that many of his base believe. This is because of a lot of changes to the way media happens in the United States, but also because of Trump decrying certain kinds of media as fake news, etc. But there's also a lot of evidence that Trump can't control his base, and that Trump isn't the only source of information for Trump's voting base. For instance, recently in a primary campaign in Arizona, I think it's Arizona, Trump endorsed a primary candidate from the Republican establishment who lost. So, does this mean that Trump voters overwhelmingly follow Trump's advice or believe that Trump is doing the right thing? Or does this mean that Trump really can't control his base, and that Trumpism as a phenomenon might be something that's outside the control of Trump? So I think there's evidence here on both sides, and I think there's good argumentation here on both sides, which is why I think it might make good debates. But it's important to recognize that there are ways in which Trump can control his base, and there are ways in which you argue that he can. For instance, the ways in which he communicates directly with his base via Twitter, which is something a president hasn't done before. A president hasn't had this sort of direct line of communication to the people in a really long time. So that's the way in which Trump is trying to exert some control over his base, exert some control over his particular message, and I think is different from other presidents or different from ways in which he might not be controlling his base. But clearly, the sort of elements of Trumpism that I mentioned that Trump has tapped into are different from Trump himself. And so it may be that his voters have some interests that are different from the interests of Trump. So how much of this is Trump, and how much of this is the people around him? People around him have changed a lot over the last weeks. But there's always lots of, I think, media storm and lots of Twitter discussion about how John Kelly is going to be the adult in the room, or how different individuals are going to be able to exert control over Trump. Ivanka and Jared Kushner were sold as this kind of shadowy but still not totally illegitimate advisors to Trump who are going to be able to stop him from getting rid of same-sex marriage, etc. So I think there is some evidence that this is Trump, that Trump is in control of his messaging, is in control of what's happening, and that Trump is acting independently from the sort of people around him, from his advisors. The way Trump has acted has been quite different from other presidents, as in the administration does not act as a single unit. The administration acts as Trump and the administration. So different evidence of this is, one, Trump's willingness to contradict his surrogates in the press constantly. His surrogates like Sean Spicer or Kellyanne Conway, or many of his cabinet representatives or his press secretaries will go out and say one thing, and Trump will appear on Twitter or appear on the news or whatever the next day and say something completely different, and he totally disagrees with these people, and that was all wrong. So there's some evidence that Trump has some control over his message. For instance, the way he's definitely trying to keep control of his Twitter account, that he has control over his message that is different to the message of the administration. Two, I think his opposition to congressional Republicans demonstrates that the administration does not act as a single unit. Because if this was congressional Republicans or elite Republicans or sort of establishment Republicans able to control Trump, I don't think Trump would be in the press trashing Paul Ryan and trashing Mitch McConnell constantly. He would be supporting them. He would be trying to get their repeal Obamacare stuff passed. Whereas Trump would often say, like, no, we don't want to repeal Obamacare that way. No, we're not going to do it the Paul Ryan way. We're going to do it my way. And so his opposition to congressional Republicans has been something that demonstrates that him and the administration act separately. Lastly, I think this is one particular example that I think sort of stands out. This is what's being called the Nancy and Chuck deal around DACA, which is a deferred action for childhood arrivals. So there are a number of individuals who, under a legislation called DACA, who arrived in the United States when they were children, but arrived as illegal immigrants, are able to stay in the country legally despite having arrived illegally, because the United States recognizes that if you arrived when you were a minor, you didn't have any control over it, and you were often brought here by parents when you were very young, and you've lived in your country your whole life. And many individuals who are called dreamers, many individuals who live under a DACA did not know that they were illegal immigrants until they tried to get a driver's license when they were 16, or until they tried to go to university. Many of them serve in the military, many of them work in the United States, and the Democrats have been fighting very hard against the repeal of DACA, or the idea that all of these young people should be deported to countries that many of them have never lived in or do not remember. So, but congressional Republicans are very set on repealing DACA. It appeals to their base. It says we should get rid of illegal immigrants, and it's something they're ideologically committed to. However, Trump was apparently convinced over Chinese food with the House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi and the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, who are both Democrats, to come to a deal with Democrats on DACA, on keeping Dreamers in the United States, in order to avoid Democrats shutting down the government. Now, this is exactly opposite to everything Republicans want, to everything congressional Republicans are interested in. But Trump and several Trump surrogates were able to announce that this deal had been made. later he contradicted himself later on, but that was a huge blow to congressional Republicans and an undermining of their authority that Trump was going to go over their heads and make deals with Democrats over making deals with Republicans. So there's some evidence that, I think there's significant evidence that Trump acts separately from the administration, and often the administration isn't able to control him, and that and so the idea that this, whatever all this is the sort of people around Trump is, I think, one that doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Okay, so we're going to talk about one sort of final thing. First of all, in terms of staying informed, how are you best able to stay informed on American politics, on American issues, in a way that isn't overwhelming? Because if you're a debater and you're trying to prepare for a number of different events coming up, you have a lot of reading to do and you have a lot of work to do. So how do you stay informed in a way, stay informed in American politics that helps you for debating, not just in terms of reading? So first of all, in terms of staying informed, there's a number of different newsletters that I'm subscribed to that I find very useful for this. First of all, there's from the website Vox, there's a newsletter called Vox Sentences. This is delivered to your inbox every morning, and it has a sort of rundown of the top news stories from an American perspective in sort of bite-sized chunks with links to the articles from which those bite-sized chunks came from. It's very good if you want to do further reading, and it's very well cited. And because it gives you a rundown from an American perspective, and often make sure you're up to date on the most recent American political news. Another newsletter that I get that I find very useful is the Council of Foreign Relations. So the Council of Foreign Relations is a foreign policy sort of think tank in the United States. It has a newsletter on foreign policy. That's very useful for understanding international relations debates. But because it often interprets international relations from an American perspective, it's very good for understanding America's role in the world from the perspective of the United States. And they send you a newsletter so that you can read it in your inbox sort of once every week, and that's very useful. But sort of what sources are going to be the best sources to sort of read every now and then or read semi-regularly to make you better at American debates? So I have a bit of an unpopular opinion here. I don't think The Economist is a particularly good source for understanding American politics or interpreting the U.S. I think it's just because The Economist approaches writing about the world and writing about politics from quite a policy perspective, and I don't think it's necessarily the most useful sort of a view to have of American politics. But there are a number of sources that I think are most useful. One, I think obviously the New York Times, but the New York Times is a bit more into sort of play-by-play reporting, which I don't think is the most useful for debaters. But the New York Times does have one really excellent source, which I get, a newsletter sort of once a week, which gives you some links and some short summaries of left-wing and right-wing writing on the most important news stories of that week. So the most recent newsletter has been left-wing and right-wing writing in response to the upcoming or the soon-to-be upcoming Republican tax bill. I think it's really good for understanding criticism of Trump and Trumpism from the right, and sometimes support of Trump and Trumpism from the right, and criticism of Trump and the Trump government from the left. I think if you're really interested in detail, or you want some interesting detail, sort of a policy wonks perspective, Politico is really a good source for that. They're really good at detail. I read Vox a lot. Vox are extremely good at briefing styles, so being like, what do we know about this particular issue and what's the most recent up-to-date information? So they're great for developing or evolving stories. They're left-wing, but I think they're not as sort of hysterical as other left-wing sources are in the US about Trump or Trumpism. I think they can give some good briefings there. If you like podcasts, I'd suggest Crooked Media podcasts. There's one called Pod Save the World, which is foreign policy from an American perspective, and Pod Save America, which is American politics. Obviously highly biased. The people who present the Crooked Media podcast are former Obama bros. John Favreau was Obama's chief speechwriter. So they're very heavily involved in the Democratic Party. So it's very biased, but it's a good sort of, I think, view into how Democrats are ideologically approaching the sort of problem of Trump and the sort of problem of this government. But I also think they're good podcasts and they're pretty funny. Like I said earlier, The Atlantic is really the best at writing on American culture and society right now. It's the best understanding of American racial politics and some of the best writers on American society right now. If you want to sort of get a better view of American society that doesn't just come from watching American TV, I think The Atlantic is the place for you to read. Okay, so one final bit, I know this has gone on quite long, so one final bit is talking about motions that are about America or the US, or motions about the US. There are sort of 5 types of motions that I've identified from reading a really long list of every motion I could find about the US that's been set in the last 2 years. One, dissecting the election. So dissecting the most recent election. This is some stuff like this House regrets Hillary Clinton's focus on her gender. This House regrets the focus of the Clinton campaign on Trump's personality as opposed to policy. This House, example, this House regrets the decision of Clinton supporters in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 US election to frame the Trump victory as a result of misogyny and racism and not opposition to the political establishment and or neoliberalism. So this is examples of sort of rehashing the election, sort of dissecting it, figuring out what went wrong, so that's kind of an understanding of the sort of themes I was talking about. What kind of things has Trumpism found in the American electoral psyche that makes it work so well, and that the Democratic Party or that other parties are going to have to contradict in order to win. Number 2 is like ways to prevent Trump in the future. So a good example of this is this House would require those seeking election to be president of the United States to have served a minimum of 5 years as a national or statewide elected official. So this is kind of talking about, I think this debate is about how do we stop Trump in the future? How do we make it so that somebody like Trump can't get elected again? I think that's a debate about how will Trump's base react? How is the kind of things that Trump's base believes is going to go away because of these new policies? The next kind of motion I've identified is, I think, one that's not particularly unique to the new America or the new Trump America, but that I think has been a debate that has been set for a few years. It's about race in America and about how America reacts to its racial politics. So good example, this House supports the creation of armed self-defense organizations by African Americans in the United States. This was from my list of motions that has been set previously about the United States. This was set at Warsaw. This House supports Barack Obama's statements that emphasize African Americans taking individual responsibilities for improving their own position in life. So talking about how African Americans react to their first Black president, how the United States deals with its racial politics and its history of slavery and a history of racial oppression. This one, I think, is best understood through a lens of the many and intersecting ways in which African Americans are oppressed in the United States, in which racial groups are oppressed, and that these can be different across racial divides. Then the sort of last 2. One is American foreign policy. So this is stuff about the American war on terror. This is stuff about drone strikes around the world. American foreign policy is best, I think, understood from America's interest, not just in its own self-protection, but the idea that there has been a long-running thread for many years in American foreign policy thinking that the best way to protect America is to protect the world. And that's one of the reasons why America has the most active military, is that it is trying to do this everywhere. Trumpism represents a reaction to this. How can America protect itself when not protecting others? So this is the America first kind of policy. This is the idea of America first. The last sort of theme I've identified is called the American mindset. So this, I think, has been set a few different versions of this have been set a few different times. One of this was this House believes America should never use the language of American exceptionalism. Another is this House regrets the American dream. So this is about American society, about the myth of America. I think this is where you're best equipped to have read a little bit of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, because the Constitution and the Declaration are really held up as the founding myths of the United States. And understanding them and having done a little reading to them, and I think doing a little reading about American culture is what's going to equip you for these debates. If you have any questions, there haven't been any questions. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me a line or send me an email, which I'll include in the notes that I'll put in the summary, or send me a Facebook message, and I'd be happy to help. I hope this has been useful, and I hope you'll all be a lot better about debates about America in the future. Have a great evening.